Let me pray for us first. Lord, thank you for us meeting together. Thank you for another night we can do this. And I pray that you would open our eyes and our hearts and our spirits to what you have to teach us. We know that these are spiritual words and spiritual concepts, and only your Spirit can interpret them for us and apply them to us and teach us. So be here in our midst. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so we are starting tonight in verse 26 of Daniel 2, and we're only going to really get through verse 34, and then next week I'm going to take us through the rest of the second chapter. So what we're really going to get through tonight is talking about the basic meaning, particularly of the first elements of this statue that, of course, Nebuchadnezzar saw and Daniel also saw, that God showed him. And the reason why we're not going to get through all of it is because I think you'll find that the last part of it has very, very interesting prophetic implications, and multiple ones. So it's too much to get through in 1 week. So let's start by reading verses 26 through 30 and cover that first. So, we'll say, I'll go back to 24. Okay? Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon, and he went and spoke to him as follows: Don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: I have found a man from the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. I told you last week at the very end, he sounds like the standard administrator of the ages. Now, my wife defended him and said that he showed some, what you said, he showed some courage in doing that, or I think it's what you said. I can't remember exactly how you put it.
You're talking about Arioch.
Arioch, okay. But on the other hand, and it may be right, but on the other hand, he did take credit. Well, I think credit was really not due for him. And don't forget, of course, that one of the things that was promised is if you can interpret this, you will. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar said?
Well, you're going to make him.
You'll get all kinds of goodies.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that in there?
Yeah, it's in there. Okay. So at any rate, so verse 26, the king so he brought him in to the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. In other words, i.e., you guys failed. Okay? 28. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, the mystery has not been revealed to me, for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man. But for the purpose, and this is really important, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. So, Of course, Arioch rushes them into the presence of the king. Daniel, of course, makes it clear to him, not my ability, not my power, not my skill interpreted this. It was through us asking the Lord to show us, and he showed us. And that God, the God of heaven, is the one who knows all mysteries. Now, it's fairly clear here in 2 verses that we see that the king apparently was contemplating his own future and that of his kingdom around the time that he had this dream, and then received the dream from the Lord. And of course, then he sends Daniel the interpretation and reveals to the dream and its meaning to the king. Now, again, this dream and this event is unique. Here's the Jewish Old Testament, and yet what is this dream all about primarily? Gentile history.
Yeah.
Okay? It's a very unique thing. As a matter of fact, you don't have to turn here, but in Luke 21:24, it talks about the times of the Gentiles. You know, and this is what this dream is all about, the times of the Gentiles. Notice that the Lord was not revealing spiritual truths to Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't talk to him about salvation. He didn't talk to him about sin. He didn't talk to him about Jewish sacrifice system. He didn't talk about any of those things. But rather, he was revealing to him the facts and events of political entities in the future. And, of course, as a result of it, it is made known to the king that he's only in power because God has willed it. That's kind of an underlying, concept you need to understand here. When Daniel reveals this to him, it's like, buddy, Daniel doesn't say it, but because of, I think, also Nebuchadnezzar's response to it, it's like, buddy, you're the one because God made you the one. No other reason. Okay? Now, we have a little video here that I think is interesting. It's only about 3 minutes, and I think you'd like to watch it before we go on with the next set of verses. So it's called Nebuchadnezzar's Dream in video form. Remember, the statue was huge. So there's the golden head. Oh, really? Okay. So here's the chest and arms of Medea Persia. There's the bronze. There's Alexander. And now the legs and feet. Rome. and the mystery of the feet. And next, the rock that comes down and topples.
No wonder he was disturbed.
And then the rock grows. And becomes a mountain. And, quote, fills the whole earth. So, I thought it was my wife found that as a really nice little depiction. So let's go through it. Let's read verses 31 to 34 and then start to take this apart, hopefully. So, starting with 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. So he had to feel like a munchkin in this thing, looking up at this massive metal statue. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. I'm going to stop there because really I think that's enough for us to start to go through tonight. So let's take this apart. Now, the dream image itself is relatively straightforward, but of course its interpretation is more complex. The king saw this massive statue made up of metals except for the feet, that is the toes, which ended up being a combination of a metal and, quote, miry clay. And we'll get to the significance of why it's called miry clay next week. Interestingly enough, the statue started with the most precious and moved towards the least precious. But conversely, it also began with the most dense elements, yet the least strong, that is the most malleable, okay, and moved towards the least precious, but the strongest. Now,
he said the second part.
Okay, let me say it again. The statue started with the most precious and moved towards the least precious, right? But conversely, it also began with the densest elements, yet least strong, that is most malleable, and moved to the least precious but strongest metals. Now, this I have pondered all week long.
Except for the clay, though.
Except for the clay, which is, it says, it talks about the feet and the toes, all right? Just kind of a separate entity that's rather different than the iron legs, okay, themselves. Now, this is worth, if someone wants to take up a good research project, please be my guest and give us more insight into why this is true this way. The only thing that's come to my mind as I've thought and prayed about this is that the reason why possibly he starts with Babylon being the head of gold, and therefore the most precious element, is because the Babylonian kingdom was the first and foremost that he appoints to begin this whole political process over the generations. So its appointment is to Nebuchadnezzar first. That may be why it starts with that element. And I'm going to show you why there are some really interesting enigmas in all this. So the head, of course, is gold, which represents Babylon. Babylon became the number one power of the Middle East. And much like gold, which is very expensive but rare, it was the undisputed power, but only for 67 more years. It only lasted in its maximum power state from 606 to 539 BC. Now, it existed before that time, but never in this power. It existed for several hundred years as a city-state, virtually kind of semi under the control of the Assyrians. And of course, it had kings before Nebuchadnezzar, but never any king that had the authority and power and the control and the dominance of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's very interesting that it starts with this gold head, which is the most precious, and actually in the Aramaic it says pure gold, no alloy. All right, which I think is another. I mean, I read an article about going back to the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, and going through this thing, and then also going through it in Aramaic. And of course, they tear it down word by word, tense by tense in the language. But my,
Yeah.
I got pages and pages into it. I thought, okay, we're going to stop here. But it's very interesting. Now,
Could it be that too, like you said, it wasn't that powerful, but as Nebuchadnezzar took over, it became more powerful.
Way more.
Yeah.
Way more. Okay? But short-lived. Mm-hmm. It's the shortest-lived empire of all, by far. By far. Okay? I'll show you the approximate dates of the others. Now, despite that it has a unique quality in its system of idolatry, and we find that its characteristics return towards the end of the age. That is, in Revelation 17:18, we have mystery Babylon. Okay? This is not true really of the other kingdoms. Now we'll discuss the, quote, revived Roman Empire next week. But Mystery Babylon is seen in Revelation 17:18. It's both an economic system and a religious system that is set up and utilized by the false prophet and Antichrist. Thus, it features the Babylonian occult system, quote, as I say, on steroids. Because if you remember, I kind of reminded you again last week of what it was like for Daniel being in this culture, which was just completely taken up with the occult. Spells being cast on people, counter spells being cast. I mean, sicknesses being caused in people, reverse, chants where they'd hire these people. Their doctors were really, quote unquote, more exorcists and magic spell with plants people than anything else. I mean, it was just, you almost, until you read some of these documents, you almost can't appreciate how unbelievably occultic this was. And that these people just lived in fear of demons constantly. So again, it gives you an impression when you read some of that literature about what the future in this revived system is going to be like. That, of course, Antichrist will run.
You don't read about any spells being put on Daniel.
No, absolutely not. Because, of course, he would be immune from them. Absolutely true. It's a very good point. Now, I think this, because of the revived nature that's going to occur of the Babylonian system in the future with Antichrist, I think that may be one of the reasons why Nebuchadnezzar is called King of Kings. He can't be called King of Kings because of the length of his reign, because he has the shortest reign by far of all empires. So I think it might imply that it's because he has there's this future element to his empire and the nature of it that maybe that's why he may be called King of Kings. Okay? Now, again, I think there's more food for thought about these fascinating passages as we go on, even in the next week. So there's the gold head. Let's take the chest and arms that were of silver. Now, of course, undoubtedly, the reason why it was not only the chest of silver but the two arms is that the first major and most powerful king, not the first king, but the most powerful king of Media-Persia was Cyrus. We know that he had one parent who was a Mede and his other parent was a Persian. Yes. So he had a parent of both ethnic groups. In the same way, this empire was made from these two ethnic groups and was forged together by Cyrus into one political and military entity. Now, this empire lasted much longer, from exactly 539 BC to just about 330 BC.
Which is how many years?
Which is really close to 200 years.
And previous?
67 years. So it's a bigger area of the body, okay, the chest and the arms, and certainly the head is, and maybe that's part of the reason why it's a bigger area.
Excuse me, 67 years, this is from the moment of the...
From the time, no, 67 years was the Babylonian Empire's length, okay? The Media-Persians, the second is about 200 years length in empire.
And there is no Assyrians in this picture?
No, they were before. They're not included in this.
Okay.
It starts with...
The dream is about future.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Now, remember, Cyrus is a unique person in history. He was called by name in Isaiah 45, 150 years before he was born. Think about that. God named him in Isaiah 150 years before he existed. And of course, he was selected to bring the Jews back from Babylon to Judea, just like Nebuchadnezzar was selected to capture the Jews from Judea and bring them to Babylon. So both of them had a specific mission that God used them for. Turn, if you would, to Isaiah 45. Don't take your hand out of Daniel, but I want you to read a few verses because I think it's kind of interesting information about this. We're going to read verses 1 through 5 of Isaiah 45. Starting verse 1. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, notice what he calls him. His anointed. Now think about that. You know, usually to call someone your anointed as a Jew had to do with a special title of, well, it's most commonly used of Messiah, the anointed one, okay? It's not only, the kings were often called anointed ones. The priests were sometimes called anointed ones, but it's certainly a very special term and uniquely Jewish, and yet he's called the anointed one of the Lord, okay? Whom I have taken by the right hand, that is, I'm directing you, okay? To subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. Now, that is an allusion to something that we will go into in the future in chapter 5, because it's a very direct, literal allusion for how Cyrus conquers Babylon 150 years and more before he does it, okay? It actually tells him the tactic of how it will occur, okay? Now, verse 2, I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through their iron bars. Again, literally a tactic of how they conquered the city of Babylon. And hidden wealth of secret places, in order that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. For the sake of Jacob, my servant, remember, the south, okay, and Israel, my chosen one, I also have called you by your name. I have given you a little title of honor. In other words, you get in 200 years, pal, you and your empire. Though you have not known me, because you haven't been born yet for 150 years. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no other. I will gird you, though you have not known me. Isn't that an interesting direct statement to someone that hasn't been born to 150 years and tells them exactly what they're going to do in their life? Mm-hmm. That's God's prophetic way, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So, the Medo-Persians had a policy like the Babylonians to utilize, quote, the cream of the crop of their conquered cultures to become government workers in many of their provinces. Thus, when Babylon is conquered, we find in Daniel 5, Daniel is not demoted, but used to rule over these provinces were called satraps. So over the 150 satraps of the kingdom. And we can see, and you might do that, go over from Daniel 2 to Daniel 6. I'll just point this out to you here. We'll read 3 verses. It says, it seemed good to Darius, okay?
Is that Darius or Cyrus? That says right here, Darius.
I believe there is some confusion at times. Darius sometimes is called Cyrus because he has names like someone may call him Michael or Mikey or okay. And there is some confusion at times about exactly, but we think probably here it's referring directly to Darius, okay? I mean to Cyrus. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. So he's got to have his government workers to administer this whole thing. And over them, 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Probably that could mean like, where'd the money go? Okay? This is a government, remember. They eat money, if you haven't figured it out. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So after the Medo-Persians take over, and not too long, they recognize Daniel as a pretty qualified guy who has some very unique qualities like Nebuchadnezzar saw. And so he ends up again rising to the top as being a chief official now in this new administration. I didn't pull this, but I got a book downstairs that's ancient documents. And it's interesting because in a number of them around this era, you have different political figures quoted talking about the wisdom of Daniel, the prophet of Israel. These are from secular sources. They knew about him. His fame was widespread in the ancient world. He wasn't just a little Jewish guy that was only known in the Old Testament.
And yet, many scholars have tried to denounce that he never existed.
I know. They do, and of course they do it by trying to argue that all of these things that we know, for instance, these historical documents, they of course try to late date the book of Daniel because, they don't want to admit that God knows prophetic history because they can't accept that about God. So they have to say that, that either he wrote it late or some group of people that whose pseudonym was Daniel wrote it. And of course it's ridiculous. There's no evidence to that whatsoever. When you look at the continuity of the writing, the style of the writing, the nature of the writing, it's consistent, except for chapter 4, because that was written by Nebuchadnezzar himself. So that's right. So that one's different. But now let's go to the next part. The next part of this great statue is the belly and thighs of bronze. This represents, of course, the next kingdom of Greece. Now, as I say here, anyone who has seriously played sports, weightlifted, etc., knows that the core muscles of the abdomen and its connection through the hips to the thighs is the crux of the strength of the body. That's what you strengthen your core. Your upper body is not your strongest part, okay? And certainly from your knees down are not your strongest part, all right? It's this middle, from the middle of the abdomen down to the very top of the thighs that is the strength of the body. And, if you played football, you go to the weight room and that's what they work on to a great extent. So I think this indicates something about this next kingdom. It's remarkably strong. So in the same way, this kingdom would be unusually strong. Now, remember, we have a history of Greece that goes back probably into the 800s or so BC, maybe even 900s BC. But until 300 in some 20-ish BC, in other words, for 500 to 600 years, we had all these Greek city-states that constantly fought each other. Okay? And this is you read the Iliad, okay, Homer's Iliad, all right, Odysseus and all these stories. These are the stories of the famous people of the Trojan War, the Trojan horse. All these are stories of these Greek city-states. They all had powerful militaries, but they never could get along with each other. They were always in fierce competition with each other. So it went on for centuries and centuries that they killed each other in war after war. Finally, this man named Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great, finally brings them together, pulls them together, and makes one unified Greek nation out of them and one unified Greek military. Now, Alexander, who I said to my wife the other day when we were talking about this, I said, now there's a guy I'd really, if it could ever be possible, I'd love to meet. I'd like to pick that guy's brain. I mean, he was one very unusual young man. Unusual. He had to be absolutely a genius, in many things. Certainly in military strategy, an absolute genius.
Because God, though, wasn't giving him the Daniel's wisdom.
Say again, Ian?
God was not giving Alexander Daniel's wisdom.
That's true. But God apparently gave him a dream. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
He marches to Jerusalem. And some months before he gets to Jerusalem, he has this dream of a man in a white, completely white robe with a special, well, we call it ephod, of course, and a special head covering, in other words, the high priest. And he warns him and says, don't take Jerusalem, don't mess with this man. So when he marches up to within miles of Jerusalem, okay, we have historical documents about this. The high priest is directed by God also, I believe, in the dream, to walk out and meet Alexander. So he walks out and meets Alexander, and Alexander says, I saw you already. I've seen you in a dream. God showed him exactly what he's going to look like. And they talk, okay, and Alexander says, have a good day, sir, and marches south. Okay? So God spared Jerusalem from Alexander's army because of this dream. God didn't always spare everyone, the Jews, certainly, but he did in this particular case. So, we find that this son, Alexander, goes on a world conquest over 11 years' time. He has 31 major battles over literally thousands of miles of territory, and is 31 out of 31. He doesn't lose one of them. Okay? I'm not certain we can find anyone in history that I know of that did that, other than Alexander. You know? I mean, if you're winning 60 or 7% of your battles, you're doing unbelievably as a general. But this guy was 100%. So he ends up conquering all the way from Greece across the rest of eastern, the eastern part of Asia, Eurasia, crosses over Turkey, keeps going, goes through Syria, goes through Iraq, goes through Iran, goes through Babylon, okay, keeps going further and ends up in northwest India and is conquered all the way to the Indus Valley. And if you look on a map, that is one long way to march a military, okay? Because these guys don't exactly have tanks and Humvees and things like this.
Plus, his generals didn't want to proceed.
Yeah.
They
So,
wanted to stop.
so what happens, they get to northwest India, Alexander says, okay, we've got a new topography, we've got a new type of enemy, let's figure this out. And they have a little powwow, he and his 4 generals. And his generals, of course, were tremendously loyal to him. They know, they got their ear to the troops. And they say, sir, you keep going.
We're tired.
The men are absolutely exhausted, and they're going to rebel against you. And there's going to be like a civil uprising in your own army. So they were very insistent about this with Alexander, we know from historical records. And so I think wisely, Alexander turns around and he starts going back. I think it's very interesting, 2 things. Number one, where he stops, where he himself stops. A lot of his troops went back eventually to Greece, but he didn't go back. Where did he stop? In Babylon. He makes it his second capital, and he ends up dying there. And I think that's
Very old either.
he was 31. He started when he was 19 or 20, and he dies, we know, in forget what month we know, but I forget it now, at age 31. So at any rate, of course, we know the story, and the Bible tells us the history of this. They ask him on his deathbed, who gets the empire? And he says, the strongest. That's his answer. So the generals decide, well, having extended wars with each other maybe is not the best idea at this point. So they just decide to carve it into 4 parts, and each one takes a part. And so that's what they do. So we find that we go from 330-ish, around 330 BC, till around-ish 125 BC. Around 125, they're not completely overcome by this next empire, but this next empire, Rome, is making some very strong inroads militarily, and the handwriting is pretty much on the wall. When you get down into about 70 BC, Rome's dominant at this point, absolutely, and they have overcome Greece.
Did they like slowly but surely?
Yes. They built, they started out, built a huge military, started to take more and more Greek territory, until finally they just pretty much consumed, well, they ended up consuming really all of what Alexander essentially conquered, pretty much, eventually. So, this empire, of course, we know is the Roman Empire. It is the legs of iron and feet, partly of iron and partly of clay. Now, iron, of course, is the strongest metal of all these, overwhelmingly strongest. Okay? Its tensile strength is many times any of the others. Its legs seem to indicate the speed and breadth of its might. Its feet seem to imply its stability, because Rome lasted as an empire for a very long time. The western side lasted for over 500 years. And the eastern side of the empire, which kind of morphed, we'll talk about it in a minute, into another type of empire when Constantine made some changes, lasted from I think from 320 or 330 until 1204 AD. So the eastern side lasted itself 900 years. That's a long time. Now it changed and kind of morphed just like the western side did. But let's look at this for a minute. Rome, of course, had a very different policy towards whom it conquered. That policy was smash them into the ground. There was never any tolerance of the Romans towards anyone they conquered. Okay? If you negotiated with them, you were a slave. If they didn't kill you, you were a slave. No empire up until this time ever enslaved more people than the Roman Empire. They had millions and millions and millions and millions of slaves all across the empire. So they showed no mercy. The Roman peace was called the Pax Romana. You remember taking ancient history at all and studying the Pax Romana? It's the Latin word for Roman peace, the Pax Romana.
What's Roman peace?
Pax Romana, that's what it's called.
What is it?
Okay. The Pax Romana means there will be no uprising. There will be no civil uprising. No one's going to say a word against Caesar. No one's going to lift an arm against Rome or any of its military whatsoever. And of course, they maintained this by cruel and brute force. They were vicious. Any type of uprising, they would march legions into it and just crush wherever it was, tear their buildings down, and kill and enslave those that still lived and move on. They were like a bulldozer. That's how they maintained the peace of their empire.
Like in the crucifixion.
Oh, they were just as brutal as you could imagine. And this is why when we go to Daniel 7 here in weeks and weeks to come, where it talks about these four kingdoms in a somewhat different way, this kingdom is described in Daniel 7 as the most vicious. It's the most vicious, and indeed it was the most vicious. Now, the really interesting element of all this is about the statement of the feet being a mixture of iron and miry clay. Miry clay is an interesting phrase, miry, because it is the same phrase that's used, okay, to describe that substance that God put together to create Adam. Same word. Miry clay. So, it has some very interesting implications. Now, it begins a very fascinating aspect of the prophetic nature of this entire dream. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are multiple prophetic applications to these feet, partly of clay, partly of iron, and that those applications become more evident as the time gets closer to the end. And I'll show you just an aspect of what I mean tonight, but next week we'll really go into it full bore. Okay? Now let's talk about the historical application first of what this partly iron and partly clay means. I think its first meaning is more historically obvious. As Rome conquered more and more territory, it needed more and more military to maintain its empire. You couldn't recruit enough Italians to do this. They ran out of people that they could put in their military. So they were forced to make a decision. To have enough troops, they needed to enlist people that weren't Italians. And so that's what their policy became.
Roman.
The Roman policy, yes. So what happened is they started a program of allowing citizenship for other ethnic groups if they would become part of the military and serve. So you end up finding that there are Greek military in the Roman military. There are Turkish in the Roman military. There are Syrian in the Roman military. You know, they start to spread out, and because the manpower drain was so huge, they included more and more and more ethnic groups, trying to include them in their military. But of course, they created another problem for themselves. They solved one problem by getting a whole lot more people, but they created a different problem for themselves, and that is they diluted loyalty to the kingdom. Because you're not going to have Turks having the same loyalty to the empire that Italians do, right? They're born in they have different customs, they're born in a different place, you know, and of course, so they start to fragment this system. Now, it's further fragmented by, of course, diluting the money, which they did badly, the Roman money. They diminished its value. It started out being, I think, I forget whether it was originally gold or silver. They quickly made it smaller and smaller. If it did start with gold, I think it did. Then they made it silver, their coinage, and then of course made that smaller and smaller. And then of course it became bronze, and of course, you know, just like empires do, they need more money, and so what do? They start, you know, diminishing the value of their coinage because of the debt level they have. And this is exactly what Rome did. Plus, of course, it had all kinds of political problems out the wazoo over time. Plus, there was incredible corruption. All these things began to dilute and diluted the western side more rapidly than what became the eastern side. On top of this, there was a massive immigration movement, especially around the 2 and 300 AD, where Germanic peoples and Frank, that is French peoples, and British peoples came into the empire, you know, they heard about the greatness of Rome, and so they want to come to the big city, as it were. You know, it's no different than today. I mean, what do poor people in almost every culture want to do? They want to come to the big city because that's where the jobs are. So they move into and this is exactly so this place eventually by, 400 AD was just absolutely overrun by all these ethnic. So they had a massive immigration problem, which just killed the western side. Now, eventually, of course, we know, and those of you that grew up in the Catholic Church particularly know, that as the church grew, it grew into this form called the Roman Catholic Church, and it merged itself with the political elements of the Roman Empire, and so it became the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? Now, Constantine, in around 320, was emperor of Rome, and he made a decision. And that is, he decided the handwriting was on the wall for the West. So he moved his capital to the east. And he went to Turkey to a city called Byzantium. And he renamed it, not in humility, Constantinople. Lacking humility, he called it. And this became his Eastern Empire. Now, it has an interesting history, too. So the point is you have two legs of the Roman Empire. You have the western side and you have the eastern side. Okay? This became what we call the Byzantine Empire. And you can read in your history books about the Byzantine Empire. And it also merged, the political elements merged also with the religious elements. And you find Eastern Europe and Turkey and all these areas. The Orthodox Church, of course, comes to ascendancy and merges with the political entities, and this becomes the Byzantine Empire. So in both cases, this occurs. So there's the two legs occurring. Now, I think this is particularly interesting, and I'm not going to try to go into it a lot further tonight because I think we need to stop here. Notice, first of all, that no one directly conquers Rome. It just kind of devolves and changes, both on the western side and on the eastern side. Now, we see here, of course, that it seems to, in some way, revive. And we'll go into that next week. And, of course, prophecy books for many years now, as they've studied these passages, have talked about that the Antichrist will have the revived Roman Empire, right? Mm-hmm. Hal Lindsey started probably more than anyone else talking about many, LaHaye's wrote books and books and books about it. We have all kinds of people that talked about the revived Roman Empire. And of course, about the time that we had what's called the Treaty of Rome, which was 1960. Or really close to 1960, it laid the groundwork for what today we call the European Union. You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. Yes? Okay. Mm-hmm. Historically, that's what happened. And of course, then we had the development of the European Union, and we had the growth of more countries coming into this thing called the Common Market. It was first called the Common Market, and then later was changed through further treaties into the European Union. And I believe there's 28 now in the European Union. I think it's 28. Yes.
So what's the meaning of iron on clay?
Okay. It means that the feet and the toes are partly brittle and partly strong and partly brittle. Weak. And I think the immigration that I just talked to you about in the especially western side of the Roman Empire is part of the explanation for the trying to combine two things that don't combine. They couldn't combine all those ethnicities with the Roman Empire without diluting the empire and it not being in its original state and form.
But you said something about the word clay is the same which was used for creating Adam.
Yes.
And
well, I'm not going to answer that right now. That's next week. We'll get into that extensively. Now, here's how time clarifies prophecy. Because understand, time clarifies prophecy. You get an image of prophecy, and you, to the best of your knowledge, you take the events of the day, and you try to apply them to it, and you say, this is what it means. But sometimes over time, there's further events that further clarify the prophecy. They don't change it, but they make it more clear to you what it apparently means. You follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We've seen many examples of this. Now, if you were a writer in 1990 talking about the European Union, you would have said, based on the growth of the European Union and the fact that it came out of the old Roman Empire, and it did, you would have said, this is the revived Roman Empire. This will be the empire of the Antichrist. You know, we're right on the edge. This is going to happen, etc. Except they didn't pay attention to really important facts. And I just told you what it was. What happened to the western side of the empire?
Dissolved.
Because of immigration. So what's happening to Europe today?
Immigration.
Right. They're doing what any rational human being would say is completely insane. They're diluting their ethnicities by trying to combine them with people groups that will not combine. Mire, clay, and iron. Okay, they're trying to they're purposely diluting their own racial genetics, okay, their own culture. By bringing in these people, they're causing enormous problems in their cultures. They're causing incredible increase in crime.
Well, not just that, they put them higher than their own cities.
They do. They do. You know that last year Germany spent $68 billion on housing immigrants.
Oh my God.
I just read an article this week that Trudeau in Canada took one of the most famous, well-known business hotels in Toronto. I think it's an Embassy Suite. That is a big hotel that business people have gone to for years and years and years. And he demanded of that hotel that half of it be turned over to immigrants. And they put immigrants in it, and the immigrants started to kill goats in the restrooms. Okay, sacrificing goats for goat meat. They started grilling in their rooms.
Rice everywhere.
Exactly. Can you imagine the smells
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, you can imagine what happened to the bathrooms, the sanitation, bed bugs, disease, and now no one that's in the business class will even go to this place anymore. So they started to complain, the business people, to Trudeau, and you know what his answer was? We include everyone. We are a diverse culture. We don't discriminate against anyone.
Let him go with them. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Let him go with them.
Absolutely. Now, as long as
Like you go here for a month and then say
exactly. No, see, this is the mentality of the liberal. We've got to do these things because it's good for you.
Yeah.
But I don't want to do what I'm telling you you have to do.
Right.
Mm-mm. You know, it's like the left in the United States. You know, Feinstein and the horror group, the witches of the West. Okay, you know, Feinstein, Pelosi. You know, they'll tell you about all the needed poverty programs and socialism is the way. And we must have guaranteed income, and you know, if you're white, you're privileged, and you have to give up your money. And we have okay. Do you know what Feinstein is worth? She's worth almost $1 billion in net income, her family. Wow. Diane, do you think you could start by sharing with us first? I mean, if you believe in this so much, please give us just, you know, 3/4 of your net income. And I think it'll be a really good start on your socialism policy. But they never do it. So at any rate, next week, we're going to take off from here, and we're going to talk about the rest of this very interesting aspect in the applications of the feet, partly of iron and partly of clay. Okay?
You know, isn't that kind of all this and everything, and in the New Testament, Jesus